What we want to take a look at is something called the CSS Designer panel. This panel is very important inside of Dreamweaver. This is where you'll create, write, and edit all of your CSS. Now, throughout this movie, I'm going to really kind of give you a tour of this panel, and it's not designed to overwhelm you. This is a fairly extensive panel, but I do want to point out some of the major components because we're going to be working with this panel throughout the course. So the advantage to that is you don't have to remember everything that I'm telling you right now, but I do want to give you a quick tour of it. Much like I gave you a tour of the Dreamweaver interface, it's good to have at least a sense as to what the panel offers. Now, in order for us to do this, we actually need some content. So I provided you inside the local site folder a folder called HTML5up. And inside that folder, if you expand it, you can find index.html and open it. And this is a template that was created by HTML5up. Now, when you open it, you'll probably see a page that looks like this in the design view. Doesn't look all that good. In order for you to get a better sense of what the page looks like in a web browser, you can come over and click the Live button. When you click the Live button, it'll switch over to Live View, and Dreamweaver's internal WebKit rendering engine will render this page much like a web browser would. Now, if you scroll down, you'll get a much better sense as to what the page looks like. So what we want to do is take a look at this CSS Designer panel so we can get more comfortable with the features associated with it. In order for us to do that, I'm going to go ahead and close the Files panel group. You can right-click or control-click and choose Close Tab Group, and this is going to give you a little bit more space for the CSS Designer. This is a pretty big panel, so don't get overwhelmed. You'll notice it's broken up into different categories. We have Sources, Media, Selectors, and Properties. You can collapse any one of these sections simply by clicking on it. You can re-expand it by clicking on it again. Now, the sources are showing you all the different locations for all of the CSS. If I come over to the code view, inside the code view, you'll see all of the HTML that was used to create this page, and more so, as you begin to look at the top section, you'll see all the CSS files associated with this page. If we come over to the CSS Designer, we'll see those same CSS documents. Here we have skell.noscript.css, it's represented here. We also have style.css, it's represented here. We have style desktop, and it has a media attribute of desktop. Notice it's linked up here, and we do see that media label. We also have the CSS that we're getting from the Google Font API. That too is located up here towards the top. And you'll also notice that we have the style element. The style element is represented here, and these are essentially styles that are built into the page or embedded into the page. Now, if you select any one of these sources, once you select the source, if there's any media queries associated with it, or really any other styles like print styles, they'll be available here. In this case, we don't have that. Then there's an entire list of selectors. Now, I'm going to go ahead and expand the selectors category, pushing the properties category down just a bit. Notice you get a two-way arrow when you place your cursor between these different categories. You can see all of these selectors. Now, again, if we come up to the sources section and select all sources, we're seeing all of the selectors associated with this document. Now, this selectors area is somewhat confusing because it doesn't list them alphabetically, nor should it. In fact, the way the selectors are listed are really based upon how the styles appear within the document. So it's a little bit more intuitive for it to show up this way. Nevertheless, it does make it a little bit more difficult to find specific selectors. But you'll notice Adobe's built in this search field. So if we're looking for an H1 selector, you can type it in and it will narrow down the amount of selectors. And you can get pretty specific. If you're looking for a class selector, if you type in period first, you're going to narrow this down to display just the class selectors. And as you continue to type, you'll continue to filter that list. So this is pretty intuitive, and it's really a nice addition to Dreamweaver. Now, the biggest portion of the designer has to be the properties section. If you come over and select body, you'll see all the different properties associated with this body selector. Now, really, when you're working with this CSS Designer, you're probably going to be viewing this in a two-column view. If you place your cursor in between the panel set and the document window, you'll get a two-way arrow. If you click and drag to the left, you'll expand this panel to the point where it breaks up into 2 different columns. And again, you can also control the overall width of the columns by clicking and dragging this divider between the 2 columns. So there's a lot of flexibility here with the CSS Designer. The only downside, of course, is it does take up a lot of screen space. But if you have a fairly large monitor, you really shouldn't have a problem. But as you can see, the Properties section is incredibly visual. It makes it incredibly easy to add padding and margin, and also to control the position. As you scroll through, you'll eventually go through all the different categories. If you want to quickly get to a category, instead of scrolling, you can also click these buttons here to filter the Properties panel to display just those categories. Basically, what it's doing is just moving this slider to the appropriate location. Nevertheless, it's still somewhat overwhelming, and if you're looking for something specific, like in this case with layout, we really don't have anything applied, you're seeing a lot of information for no reason. If you're just trying to edit this rule, you may want to choose Show Set, and what that's going to do is narrow this down completely to show you just the set properties. You can then come over and choose a different selector, and as you choose these different selectors, you'll begin to see all the different properties associated with them. I'll continue to scroll down here a little bit so we can see a selector that has a little bit more content. So here we have some layout content. I'll come over here and select body. We have some background images. We have some text content. If you ever want to make a change, simply change these values. You can also remove them by clicking the Remove CSS property, and you can also disable the property temporarily. If you want to add a property, you can click the plus sign, or you can deselect Show Set, and you can go ahead and find the property that you want to manipulate. If you hover over a selector, a tooltip will appear, and it's going to tell you where that selector is defined. So there's a lot of functionality associated with the CSS Designer, and like I said, I don't want you to be overwhelmed with this because we're going to be using the CSS Designer throughout the course to write our CSS and to edit our CSS.